The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, religion, and music. We will explore how African Americans who've been previously excluded because of racism, segregation, and lack of opportunity have succeeded in overcoming those obstacles. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is William Thompson, Jr., the New York City Comptroller, who's recently been elected and has been doing such a wonderful job as our city, watching our comptroller, watching our money. But the thing I have to ask you, Billy, is what does the controller do, the comptroller do?
Okay. Probably 6 or 7 very important things to New York City. Now, first, a lot of people, I won't do the budget. That is kind of done by the mayor and the city council, but oversight of budget and projections on budget. And if you go back to last year, discussion about budget gap and where New York City is fiscally. So chief fiscal officer, chief financial officer for New York City. But in a number of other areas, whether it is in the power to audit and oversee where city dollars are spent, whether with nonprofit organizations or city agencies. So I have the power to audit and follow those dollars to make sure they're being spent wisely, not just on a financial basis, but how things are done, management audits also. Power over, I register all contracts in the city of New York. That's something else, so it all comes past us, and we have the opportunity to see what New York City is doing and all of its agencies. As far as settlements, legal settlements, the Corporation Council may help to negotiate them, but I have to say yes to them. So we're involved in the middle of legal settlements, all legal settlements for New York City. Oversight of the pension systems. I serve as a trustee on 4 of the 5 New York City pension systems, but chief investment officer for all of those 5 systems. Total assets, about $70 billion. 2 other things, labor law. When it comes to public jobs in New York City, done with public dollars, there is what is called prevailing wage. That's what working men and women get paid for doing those jobs. I set and enforce prevailing wage. So I have the power to debar contractors in New York from doing work with city and state who don't do that job. And then finally, when it comes to the issuance of bonds in New York City, the issuance of debt, the comptroller has to say yes to all of that. What that means is that the mayor and the comptroller will select those investment banking firms, the Merrill Lynches of the world, the Bear Stearns of the world. We will select them to underwrite New York City's bonds. So it is, when you look at the comptroller, it is the 2nd highest elected citywide position. It touches every aspect of life in New York City. And last but not least, as that 2nd highest official, the opportunity to talk and to discuss and bring out and highlight almost any issue you'd like.
Well, obviously, one man can't do this, or one woman. Well, how large is your staff? And is it a civil service staff? Is it a staff that's been around for a while? How large is your staff?
It's a combination. It's a staff of over 700 people. Right now, somewhere in excess of 720 people on staff, budget of over $50 million, even though that shrinks a little these days. But it's an office where 3/4 of the people have been there for a while, are civil service, auditors, accountants, attorneys, you name it. So it is an office that is highly professional, an office that I think has gained the respect of New Yorkers, and an office that tells it like it is. And when it comes to financial and fiscal side of things, I think an office has become very accurate, and I'm very proud of that fact.
Now, in your investments, who plans those? Do you have a staff that does them? I know you make the final decision, but how do you go about doing the investments?
Well, it's a combination of things. I mean, New York City has 5 pension boards. We have, on those boards, we have more than 30 trustees, of which on 4 of them I'm a trustee also. But it's a combination of both my staff, and it is a group of professionals. A number of them have been hired from investment banking firms or other firms that do investments. I mean, not just across the country, but around the world. And what they've done is, what we'll do is we'll put out and issue an RFP for a certain area. We'll get those responses back. We'll go through them on an impartial basis as we put together committees. They'll review them, they'll make recommendations, and then they'll go back to the boards, make those recommendations, and then the boards will hear the presentations, and then wind up voting and approving people to manage money. So the $70 billion, we farm out to different places, to different money managers all across this country and around the world to manage those dollars and bring return for the members of our pension system.
Without trying to embarrass you, what was your percentage return last year?
Not good. I think that we're probably 70% of our portfolio is in stocks. Stock market has had, exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, our assumption rate is plus 8%. We didn't get close to that last year. And obviously what I've been trying to do in the year that I've been there is diversify the portfolio a little more, have more real estate, more private equity, spread out the risk a little bit so we're not just fully dependent on the stock market. But I mean, the one thing that people should be aware is that their pensions are protected. If we lose money, the city makes up the difference, which at a certain point during these tough fiscal times, you know, it comes out, the money that we have to put into pensions comes from other places. So it is important that we diversify that risk, spread it out a bit more, do other things that are bringing some return other than just stocks, and that's what we're involved in now.
I hope the city didn't have any Enron stock.
Unfortunately, everybody did. We're heavily we're indexed. As part of any S&P 500 index, you're going to have held Enron stock. And we had tens of millions of dollars in Enron stock, of course. Like other companies, or like other public pension funds, I think everyone had Enron stock. We're all suing. Unfortunately, last year, Enron, Global Crossing, a number of other things had happened over the last year and a half. And you've gone out there and aggressively gone after assets and helped to sue and to bring some dollars back. And we've been relatively successful in doing that.
Well, we're going to talk about the short term for the city, but let's look at the long term first. It's always good to look at where we want to be. Where do you see the city's financial future going? Let's leave the short-term problems aside. We'll talk about those later. What about the long term of this great city of New York?
I think if you get 2 to 3 years down the road, and I think it will take us that long to get out of the current fiscal crisis or fiscal situation we find ourselves in, and achieve some balance. It's a combination of reductions, increase of taxes and other cost efficiencies. I think once we get there, we should do a few things, and it is looking to the future. New York City continues, and we need to grow. We need to continue to build housing and continue to move forward to make sure that we protect infrastructure. So I think you'll see a city that continues to grow and continues to build as it moves down the road. I think you'll see a smarter city in some ways. I think that the lessons of and what you're doing now is looking back on times that were tough in New York City, the mid-'70s, the early and up to the mid-1990s. You're taking the lessons of what happened there, what went wrong, what was done well. You're using it now, but as you move forward, I think that you're going to have to be a little smarter as the economy improves, as New York City stabilizes, as you start to put more money in the city government and coffers. I think you need to keep the size of government where it will wind up. In the end, will it be in the 220,000 range? Maybe. You probably need to make sure that government's a little more stable, that when the economy goes up and down, you don't have to talk about laying people off, that you reach a point of stability in New York City, and you can move forward in growth and building and just making sure that you're a smarter, better city. And I think that's going to happen. I mean, I think that people, and you're right, they look at where we're at right now and say, geez, are we ever going to get out of this? Yeah, we will. And once you get past that, it's important that you continue then to really grow, to build, to watch New York City, or to make sure that New York City continues to be the #1 city in the world. And if you look at the continued influx of people here, of immigrants into New York City, that's exactly what New York City is. We continue to be replenished by the influx of immigrants. That's good for the city's growth. We need to make sure that we continue to do that going forward.
But there are certain systemic problems that have existed in New York City. Duplication of services being one, under-taxation of certain segments of the community being another. And the question is, how do you move out of that? I mean, one thing, when you run into a problem, people get a little bit more attentive. But how do you move out of that? And what are some of those systemic changes you'd like to see made?
Well, I think in the end, if you look, as I talk about the size, and I think as you move forward in the next 2 years, taxes in some places will be increased, so that I don't think you're going to see, I mean, there's some people would have said that, real estate taxes were kept artificially low in some sectors for a number of years. Well, I think you also wanted to encourage home ownership in New York City and growth in New York City. So, is an 18% tax increase, was it a good idea? Maybe, maybe not. But at the same point, as you move forward, what may make sense as you look? No, and I talk about size of a workforce. I talk about, as that workforce, as its needs increase, well, you may want to look to a better paid, better trained workforce in New York City. That might, so at the very least, you're not increasing the size, but when good times are here, you're having, you're sharing that with the workforce. And then you're also doing things like people talk about the structural imbalance. Well, you pay down some of that long-term debt. That's good for New York City. You have years that they had in the mid and late 1990s, you had surpluses. Well, instead of spending them, pay down some of your long-term debt. Instead of incurring new debt, well, sit there and start to do pay-as-you-go capital, which you still grow, you still build, but you don't incur the long-term hit for that. There are a lot of things that could have been done in the mid-90s that when we have the opportunity again, and we will, that we should take heed of. So there are a lot of things about being smarter. The one thing is the discussion these days, as the mayor and others start to talk about new housing and new middle-income housing in New York City, low, moderate, and middle-income housing. That's important. Help the city grow. Help keep people here. Make sure that people can afford to stay here.
But see, everything in New York City has a political picture attached to it. For example, the Lama housing, which was built for middle-income, lower middle-income people, stabilized. Now, many of those people have done very well, and they still have low rents. They want to raise the rent. They want to put the buildings into co-op status, and people are fighting. And then they have political advocates who advocate for that. So almost every idea that you have to put New York City on sound fiscal basis has a political constituency that is against it or wants to deter it. How, you were very skilled. I know you built Thompson Board of Education. You're very skilled. How do you deal with that?
I think you be honest with people. And I think, going through the next couple of years, a number of steps are going to be taken that even things out in some places. At the same point, and so I think a lot of it is being honest with people, letting them understand where things are at and what has to be done. But if you look at at Lama's situation right now, it isn't just that it isn't just that the people are living there as their incomes go up and maybe they could have moved to other places, but there's no middle-income housing in New York City. And I've talked to people in Lama housing all the time. They're scared to death because there is no place to go. That's when, if you could say, well, move to a different place and you can find affordable housing in New York City, that would be one thing. They can't go anyplace. There is no affordable housing in New York City.
But every day I pass 42nd Street, 34th Street, I see tall buildings going up 34 or 40 stories. Somebody hopefully is going to live in those. What's the deal on that?
Absolutely. There is no shortage of luxury housing. And high-end rental housing in New York City. There is an incredible shortage of middle-income housing, of moderate and low-income housing, of housing for homeless individuals and homeless families. There's a real shortage of that. As you start to look at the Lama housing, no, we can't let people in Lama housing down. We're going to have to find ways to be able to be of assistance. There are those who are looking at it now, and we're looking at it now, in how you can put in, whether it's infusions of dollars in different ways, how we can help to keep people in their homes. Because in the end, you don't want New York City to become just the rich and the poor. And that's the risk that you run right now, that you will wind up with a city of people who make really great salaries and people who have really low salaries.
But then the question is, when these developers come in, they're going to build all this luxury stuff. Isn't there some way, some kind of inducements to get them to build middle-income housing? Is the profit so great that they need to build all of these monstrous skyscrapers and charge $10,000 a month? That seems obscene.
No, I know. I think that as you look, there has been some balance, but it's only in different programs where you look for 10 or 20% or credits that will push developers to build, moderate or middle income housing. New York City hasn't been involved in housing really since the Koch administration. That was when last time you made a real commitment of housing dollars or public dollars to housing. It is clear that we have to do that again. If we don't, we're going to continue to become those two cities. And we can't afford to have that happen. A city of rich in the city of poor. So we have to really work hard. Government has to say where it starts to open new tracts of housing or new tracts of land to do housing, there have to be strong middle income components. And if you look, it is not just in Manhattan, but now as the mayor talks about the west side of Manhattan being developed and lower Manhattan being, not just for offices, but for residential, there have to be middle-income housing components in those neighborhoods. And then as you start to look at development in Brooklyn, in Queens, in Bronx, and Staten Island, that has to be substantial parts also. So government has to kind of send the word out. Government has to invest. Government has to put its money where its mouth is. But at the same point, government also has to say to people, yeah, you want to build this over here? There has to be more of a middle income component. We want to see more of a mix. And not just, as I said, and the scary thing is, what is middle income in New York City these days? I'm not even sure what it is. It is clear that it is difficult for a family of four to get by on, with both parents working, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000. It's tough to make it on that. Anything less than that, it's definitely tough to make it on. So we have to just start to take a real look at what we're going to invest in, about what our priorities are going forward, and make the commitment and do it.
Now, the mayor has made a commitment. I think it's $100 or $200 million.
Well, he's talked about more than that. But a lot of that is, I think that the best part of that, and a lot of it's still undefined. A lot of that was in a blueprint. But for the first time in years, we're talking about making commitment of city dollars and resources to build housing and to create that focus. So I thought that was a good thing. At New York City and its pension boards, and as chief investment officer, we invest money in housing. So we put dollars, and we gave $135 million last year to the AFL-CIO Housing Investment Trust. We've given money to CPC to be able to do housing in a number of different ways. So maybe we can find places that we can invest because it's for return. We can invest, the city can put other dollars, and we can, along with dollars from the private sector, we can put it all together and come up with a real housing plan for New York City.
Well, one of the things I was thinking as you were talking, the Comptroller's office is going to have a major role in this, because not only the pension plans, but just looking at the flow of dollars in terms of income and expense, which then brings us closer to talking about the problem today.
Right.
The city has, I don't know what the number is, $6 billion, $7 billion, $8 billion deficit. Having worked with numbers as a college president, I know that sometimes your deficits are somewhat enlarged to get people's attention. But what is the actual deficit, and how are we going to approach it?
Okay, and what I won't do yet, because I think we're still factoring in and still figuring out how much of an impact the state, the state's budget is going to hit us. Right now, before the state unveiled their budget, New York City for the next fiscal year, and we're on a July 1st to June 30th fiscal year, so we're halfway through a year. The fiscal year, which will begin July 1st, we're looking at a gap of about $3 to $3.5 billion. Now, before the actions that were taken this year, we were looking at a $6.5 billion gap. Raise of property taxes, cuts to budget, other actions have closed about half of that. There's still another $3 to $3.5 billion to go, and that's before the state you factor in the state. Cuts to education, which would hit New York City by close to $500 million. Cuts to Medicaid, that'll have another impact. So we're still calculating a lot of that, but it is clear that that will leave between another $500 million and $1 billion gap for New York City. So that's, before you get to the state, $3 to $3.5 billion. After the state, clearly $4 to $4.5 billion gap.
Now, what are some of your recommendations for filling this gap?
Well, the one thing I've said, and it is hard if you're not going to sit at the table and make the specific cuts. No, we've talked about things like going back, and there are things, Parking Violations Bureau, Environmental Control Board, fines and penalties that have been levied over a period of years that people haven't paid. Well, that amount is about $1 billion. Now, we know you're not going to get the $1 billion. At the same point, and we've just, the Speaker of the City Council and myself, Gifford Miller, have just proposed an amnesty period. Well, that would bring in the city, we figure, $200 million. Well, that's a way to start to close that budget gap. But it is clear that the one thing, as you move forward to close budget gaps, the one thing that has to be done, it has to be done in balance. You just can't raise taxes another $3 to $4 billion. You will run people out of this city. And you can't cut another $3 to $4 billion. No one will want to live here. You will decimate police and fire and education and other services to seniors. You can't do that either. So the one thing that I've advocated all along, and I'm pleased to see that the council and the mayor have moved in that direction, is moving forward in balance, making sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the mid-1970s where we just cut everything, or understanding the lessons of the early and the mid-1990s, as David Dinkins and Rudy Giuliani focused on quality of life and focused on crime reduction. That kept people in the city. So I think those two things, trying to achieve balance in finding new revenues in one place, pushing the federal government, definitely. I mean, I think one of the areas that people are starting to focus on, and I've been focused on for a year now, is to say to the federal government, you said that, I mean, one other thing. First, half of our budget deficit was caused by September 11th and the after effects. Said to the federal government, well, half of this we did on our own. The other half we didn't. If the president and Congress and everyone promised to stand with New York City in its time of need and not let the terrorists win and change our quality of life, then stand with us now. Write New York City a check. You've promised us $21 billion in a variety of ways. Don't give us more than that. But within that $21 billion, write us a check for $3 billion now. That would make up for half of a budget deficit. Write us, I mean, the year that we're in, they should have done that. Next year, the federal government clearly should write us a check for $3 billion and help us get through this tough time. I think that's the best thing. So help from the federal government, looking for other revenues, cuts to services, and increase of taxes. I think all of that within balance is what makes sense in moving forward.
Well, as I listen to you, I think one of the keys is communication. You're very good at communicating what the nature of the problem is and some of the options. Some other political leaders are not quite so clear about it. You really have to communicate to the public both what the nature of the problem is and that the solutions won't fall adversely on one group or the other.
I think that's the one thing that I had said as comptroller that I would do is to see that both in good times and bad times, the city did not take actions that unfairly affected one group of people or one community or one borough. I think that's happened. I think that if you talk to New Yorkers and tell them where we're at and let them understand the problems that we face, but also let them understand where we hope to be 2 and 3 years down the road, they'll be there. We have gone through tough times. We almost went bankrupt in the mid-1970s. We've gone through increase of crime and a crack epidemic in the 80s. And we've come out of that, and we are right now. I mean, you know, we continue to talk about a city that is the biggest or the safest large city in America. Well, we need to continue to capitalize on that. But at the same point, it's a city that doesn't turn its back on its children, a city that understands that it'll protect its seniors and a number of other places. So I think if you get out there and talk to people and let them know where we're at and ask them to work with us and work, you know, and I think that right now, no, the mayor is an independently elected official. I am, and so many others are. Well, I think that everyone is working together because we understand where situation's at. It has to be communicated to the public so that everybody feels part of this and they can move forward.
Well, what progress are we making with the federal government in getting them to pay for the police and fire services were increased because of 9/11, and now many of them are going into the reserves, going to the military. That's an issue that needs to be pushed. What progress are we making on that?
I think it's slow there. I mean, I'll tell you that there is still money that was expended just in the cleanup of Ground Zero that the city still hasn't received. I think everyone feels we're closer to getting that reimbursement, but we still have a ways to go. The scary thing is the federal government has shown itself, and with FEMA as the head agency, has shown itself to be really inflexible in a number of different ways. Some of it flexible, as they talk about, they'll help in the rebuilding or the new building of a lower Manhattan transit hub if that's what happens. But at the same point, as you start to talk about programs which would benefit people in housing, helping to pay their mortgages and their rents, well, the federal government was supposedly going to end that on Friday. And it had only been for people in Manhattan. Well, so many other people put out of work because they didn't live just in Manhattan. They lived in all 5 boroughs. So the federal government at some point has been helpful on some things, incredibly inflexible on others. And when it comes down to just saying, you know something, write us a check, because that's what's in the city's best interest. They have basically, and the president has said no so far. So,
well, is this a partisan issue? This is a Democratic-Republican issue, because I know clearly the president and the Congress is Republican, but we have Senator Schumer and Senator Clinton who've been pushing for this. Why doesn't this happen?
I don't know. You know, I'll tell you, I think some of it is partisan, but some of it isn't. If you look at the New York State delegation, the congressional delegation, led by Congressman Charles Rangel, comprised of Democrats and Republicans, they have all been supportive of assistance for New York City. If you look at, I know our senators have been, we have a Republican governor or a Republican mayor. You would think that the president would pay more attention to them. I'm not sure, you know, I would hate to think that the country was falling back into its, or parts of the country were falling back into its New York bias or having a bias against New York City. But I will tell you, it has been, as a government official, looking to Washington for help during this time, it's been a little disheartening.
Well, having talked with some of the senators and congresspeople about some kind of specific programs, you get a response that says, this is a good idea, but then when you get to the mid-level bureaucrats who are dealing with it, they give you more obstacles, which to me says that somebody up top needs to say, do it, and forget about all those obstacles.
I don't think that having things like the Republican convention here in 2004, I think that's a good thing. I think that, you know, the closer it gets, it gives us a greater opportunity to say to Washington and to say to the president, push, as you point out, push those people in the middle to do this and get it done quickly and get things done correctly and do the right thing. And I also think it does. It says to the White House, you know something, and you know, so much of what New York City is benefits the rest of the country. It's a mistake to let New York City down in this time of need. You need to stand up. It sends a message to the world. So I would strongly, you know, and have written the president, have urged them, have supported legislation that's been introduced by Carolyn Maloney and others, and has said, you know something, now's the time to stand by New York City.
Do you think this comes from a sort of a national jealousy, envy of New York City?
I don't know that it's a national. I mean, I thought we had crossed that bridge, and I put that behind us after September 11th. I think that the rest of the country understood it could have been their city. It could have been any place in this.
But then when it comes to paying for it,
no,
they haven't come across.
It's dissipated a bit, and I think also the thing that's complicated is that there are states and municipalities across this country which, because of the change in the economy now, are all suffering. So you look at a state like California. California, I think, has it's either an $82 or $87 billion budget. They have a $35 billion budget gap. It is clearly staggering. So, you know, it's just everyone else now is looking for assistance. It has made things a little tougher.
And with Comptroller William Thompson as our leader in this, we're going to make it. Thanks again to Bill Thompson, Comptroller of New York City, for being with us on today's African American Legends.